All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely massive, a monumental shift in Mexican constitutional law that is going to directly impact millions of people. We're talking about the recent sweeping reform to Article 123 regarding housing rights for workers. You know, housing is easily one of the biggest expenses families face globally, and Mexico has essentially just rewritten the rulebook on how the state and employers have to handle it. This reform formally introduces a hard obligation for corporate entities, of any kind, to provide adequate housing for their workers through contributions to a national fund. If you're at all interested in housing policy, real estate economics, or labor rights, stick around, because this is a historic pivot that's going to reshape the landscape for decades to come.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the current housing crisis. Second, the historical evolution of INFONAVIT. Third, the specific changes to Article 123. Fourth, the new social leasing mechanism. And finally, the challenges and secondary legislation needed to make this work.
Section 1, the current housing crisis. Let's understand the real-world housing deficit.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really get why lawmakers felt they literally had to make a constitutional reform of this magnitude, we have to look at the reality on the ground in Mexico right now. According to Mexico's statistical agency, INGI, there is a staggering national housing deficit of 8.2 million homes. To put that massive number into perspective, that's over 23% of the total inventory of inhabited private dwellings in the entire country. Plus, the National Housing Survey points out that 58% of existing homes actually need construction, expansion, or serious improvement. And nearly a quarter of them, they're over 31 years old. So the sheer scale of this infrastructural deficit is just massive. Currently, about 16.4% of homes in Mexico are rented, and that's a trend we see concentrated mostly among middle-income households and younger folks. Now, what's really interesting about this is the breakdown of those renters. A full 51% of people who rent a home do so simply because they completely lack the financial resources to acquire one. They are entirely priced out of the property market. This economic barrier to ownership basically traps workers in an endless cycle of renting without ever building equity. And honestly, that frustration is a core driver behind the legislative urgency we're examining today.
Moving to Section 2, the historical evolution of INFONAVIT, tracing policy shifts over the decades. You see, the government's approach to providing housing hasn't been static. It's fluctuated quite dramatically over the last few decades. Let's move through the timeline and see how this builds, because it shows us exactly why today's reform is such a drastic reversal. Up until the 1980s, public policy focused directly on the state building multifamily housing units that were then sold to workers. But in the 1990s, they flipped the script completely. INFONAVIT stopped building homes and shifted strictly to a private financing model. They basically just provided credits while the private sector handled all the actual construction. Recently, around 2020, reforms allowed credits to be issued without intermediaries to promote self-construction. And that brings us directly to the monumental shift in 2024, which aims to bring the state actively back into the physical real estate market after being absent for decades.
Section 3, changes to Article 123, a unanimous reform for worker housing.
This reform represents a complete paradigm shift, and the voting numbers brilliantly illustrate the political reality of this crisis. Look at this. In the Chamber of Deputies, 472 votes in favor, 0 against, and just 1 single abstention. Over in the Senate, 106 in favor, 0 against. It is incredibly rare to see absolute unanimous consensus across all major political parties like this, bringing together both the ruling coalition and the opposition. It really proves there was universal agreement that the state had to intervene more aggressively to secure housing rights, because the old models just weren't cutting it anymore.
So, how does this fundamentally change the institutional mandate? Well, under the old model, INFONAVIT essentially functioned like a specialized bank, right? They administered funds and provided financial credits for private construction. The new constitutional mandate completely flips this. It requires the fund to actively return to the physical real estate market. They now have the explicit constitutional authority to directly acquire land, to construct housing themselves, and perhaps most importantly, to offer something entirely new to the Mexican legal framework, social leasing.
Which brings us to Section 4, the new social leasing, a brand new mechanism for affordable rent. This is arguably the most innovative, impactful, and highly anticipated part of this whole constitutional reform. So what exactly is social leasing? Basically, the reform adds specific language to Article 123 that establishes a housing system with a social orientation.
It allows workers to access housing through a specialized lease directly from the fund itself. Crucially, preference is given to workers who have continuously contributed to the National Housing Fund but still don't own a home of their own. Even better, the Constitution now dictates that the law must establish terms and conditions for workers to eventually acquire these leased homes in full ownership. So it effectively turns renting into a genuine pathway to property.
So the crucial point here, and this is a real game changer for families, is the financial protection built directly into the Constitution itself. The new text explicitly states that the monthly payment for the social lease can never exceed 30% of the worker's salary. By hardwiring this cap into the Constitution, legislators are taking a massive swing at preventing arbitrary pricing. They want to ensure that housing acts as an engine for social and economic stability, rather than this overwhelming financial burden that just eats up a worker's entire monthly budget.
Section 5. Challenges and Secondary Legislation. The Complications of Actual Implementation. Okay, let's take a breath and ground things for a second. While the constitutional text is undeniably historic, actually implementing this massive shift in the real world is going to be incredibly complex. The source analysis points out a few major hurdles. First off, this constitutional reform is currently just an abstract framework. It requires the creation of extensive secondary legislation to nail down the actual rules, the budgets, and the day-to-day operations. Second, think about the institutional pressure on INFONAVIT. Remember, they haven't actively built homes in decades. Now they have to manage constructing an entire universe of social housing. Third, there is a critical, absolute need for strict anti-corruption mechanisms, especially since INFONAVIT has faced transparency investigations in the past. And finally, the economic impact. Striking a balance where workers get affordable housing without putting unbearable financial strain on the corporate entities funding the whole system, well, that's going to be a very delicate balancing act in today's tricky economic climate.
Ultimately, this reform is a massive victory for formal workers and a truly fascinating evolution of labor rights. But it does leave us with a critical, lingering question. What happens to workers in the informal economy? As the analysis acutely points out, this powerful constitutional protection only applies to folks working in regular, formal conditions who contribute to Social Security. That means millions of people working informally who simply can't pay into the system are entirely left out of this new housing guarantee. So, as Mexico moves forward, building these new social homes and reshaping its cities, how will society address the millions who are still excluded from this basic fundamental right? It's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it gave you a clear, structural understanding of this monumental shift in housing policy.